Welcome, everybody, to this final session of our study of the book of James. This is week 5, and it's good to be back together for this time of study and reflection. So what we're going to do is, I don't have a lot to share in terms of background or commentary at this point. I want to kind of do a bit of review, then have plenty of time for some discussion on chapter 5. And then, as always, when we do these studies, the last session, we spend the last 10 or 15 minutes doing some wrap up and looking at the whole letter, the whole book, and talk about what we've learned, what we've gleaned, and what kind of maybe action steps we have moving forward, having read through the letter of James. So let me share my screen.
Kathy's twice.
All right, as I said, this is session 5, and hopefully you know the title by now, Count It All Joy, a study of the book of James. And when we get to our wrap-up time, hopefully we'll come back to these themes of joy and also our interpretive lens coming to us from chapter 1, verse 4, which we looked at several weeks ago. But this call to maturity and to be complete, and what that means in the life of faith. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was week 3, we paused and really reflected together on what it means to be mature in our faith, to be complete, to be whole. All of those can be translations of the Greek word telos. So as we go through chapter 5 and as we talk about the letter as a whole, hopefully both the theme of joy and these themes of maturity and completion are things that we will come back to. The major themes that we have been covering were all introduced in chapter 1: trials and testing, godly wisdom, wealth and humility. We're going to come back to the theme of wealth this afternoon: speech and anger, faith and action, the importance of the law in James, and what is authentic religion. And I think we'll circle back to that theme a bit as well today. But chapter 5 is fairly straightforward. It's 3 sections. It begins with a very stark warning to the rich, kind of a continuation of something that was introduced in chapter 4 last week. Then a call to be patient in suffering, and then finally a call to the community, really a call to be prayerful and to be steadfast in their faith. I don't know about you, but chapter 5, even more so than some of the other chapters, felt pretty disjointed, and we can talk about that. It jumps from kind of one topic to the next pretty abruptly. It also moves from kind of one mode to another pretty quickly, from being very stern in this warning to the rich in the first 6 or 7 verses, and then to a much more pastoral kind of mode when it calls for patience and suffering and to be fervent in prayer and faith. So we can talk about some of those shifts. Before we get into the final chapter, I just wanted to note something I said back in or when we started chapter 1, and that is that other than the opening acclamation and the opening salutation, there isn't much more about this letter that follows the typical pattern of a letter that you would find in the ancient world. So if you've read the letters of Paul, you know that the last chapter, or maybe even the last 2 chapters, Paul is kind of wrapping up his thoughts. He's recapping the topics that he's introduced. He's sending greetings to people. He's sending messages to the community. He's telling them when he expects to visit them again. And then there's usually some kind of final blessing at the end of the letter, or farewell message. We don't get any of that in James. It just sort of ends with this call to prayer and faith. So it kind of reminds us that this is less of a letter and more of what we might call the wisdom tradition, or a sermon, or an extended teaching, We might even say that this looks like maybe fragments or parts of various sermons or letters that were compiled over time, the way in which they've kind of been stitched together. So, sorry. That's going to happen multiple times because this is, oh my gosh, just 1 second. I'll be right back.
Kathy, your almond cookies were really good.
The recipe came from our priest, but I'm glad you liked them. That's all. They were
Thank
weird.
you. Yeah, they were good.
They were good. Yeah. Sorry about that. That was a call for my son. So I had to tell his little friend not to call. He's very persistent. He will call 7 or 8 times in a row. So, all right. So let's go ahead and just jump into the text because there's a lot to talk about in these 3 sections. And so if you've got your Bibles open, let's read chapter 5, verses 1 through 6.
I'll read.
Go ahead, Sue.
Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted, and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidenced against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure, and you have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one, who does not resist you. Pretty tough talk.
Pretty tough talk. So what do you make of these tough words from James? Go ahead, Paul.
Them to be in a letter to the early Christians. It's contrary to what I've read historically and my expectation for the audience. He's writing to the early Christians who, for the most part, are many are strongly disadvantaged. There are a few rich ones, but those that are noted in the earlier writings are fairly good rich people. They share their wealth. The women supported the early churches. So I found this aimed at rich people surprising that it took this much of the chapter, when I would have thought his audience is the exact opposite.
Yeah, that's a good point, but and maybe that's further evidence that we should read this less as a letter and more as, wisdom literature or even a sermon or an extended teaching, because if it's that sort of material, if that's the genre, then it would make sense that he would address these different issues. He's not addressing a particular, you rich people, could be, us in Palm Beach saying, hey, everybody up on Wall Street, your day is coming, right? It just sort of, it's more of a proclamation than an actual direct word to a particular group, right?
Right.
The other thing to point out, now, I want to make it clear that James and other authors in the New Testament are pretty clear that that they see wealth and riches not necessarily as inherently evil, but as a significant potential obstacle to really authentically living, the Christian life and the kingdom life. But we also have to be conscious of some of the other issues that are underneath the surface. And there's a couple that I think are very evident in this passage, where he says, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. So he's
Right.
calling out not just wealth, but exploitation,
Right.
fraud, corruption, sort of this dishonest accumulation or management of wealth that's rooted in pride and arrogance and self-sufficiency, all of which would have been contrary to the message of the kingdom of God that is, as we've been hearing the last several weeks on Sundays, is about the last being first and the first being last, and the greatest becoming servants. This upside down kingdom. Exploitation, fraud, corruption, pride, arrogance have no place. So my reading of this is, and this is strong language, it really is directed not at wealthy Christians per se, but at this wider systemic issue,
Right.
of corruption and exploitation that would have been present in the ancient world. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. But a couple other notes just to kind of really get into the richness of, I think, of what James is saying. He is doing a couple things simultaneously. He is echoing very much the voice of the ancient prophets, who, if you read Isaiah and Micah and Amos, they don't mince words, right? Israel had a calling to care for widows and orphans, to care for those on the margins of society, to welcome the stranger. And when they get caught up in wealth and building up their human power, the prophets are going to be very direct on calling that out and saying, that's all going to rot and fade away, because you're not fulfilling your purpose. And I think James is very much echoing that language of the ancient prophets. He's also, and this goes for the whole chapter here, he's also beginning to turn, and I'm going to use, $1 million theological term here. He's moving in a more eschatological direction, right? Eschatology meaning the study of the end of the age, or so this is a stern warning that, these things are all rusted and they're going to rot and fade away. And it echoes Jesus too, who said, the moth is going to come in and destroy all the stuff that you've accumulated, right? It's not, you can't take it with you. And so there's this urgency here to the rich, to stop their corruption and exploitation, because there's this imminence of God's kingdom, and we're going to see this in the second part of the chapter as well. But other thoughts? Is that helpful to kind of unpack that and get under the surface of what James is getting at here?
If you treat it as, if you accept it as a warning for the congregants that if times get better for you, you have to be careful what you do, what your actions become. In other words, since most of this is in fact a way to live your life, and he points out the how you can fall into trials and tribulations, and how times can be hard, or if you're lucky and they get good, be careful how you act in that ascension to wealth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think the emphasis on the end of time,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important as we read this to go beyond the present and what Paul is saying also, but go beyond the present of what he is saying, and know that it's pointing, look ahead with the end of time. It's going to happen. So look at So I think that kind of puts it into another little box.
Yeah.
Another turn and burn. Turn or
No.
burn.
Turn or
Right.
burn.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Good one, Bert.
Yeah.
Well, but it's also, and we see this play out in the first century, where there was a shift, where part of the New Testament, there's clearly an expectation that the kingdom that Jesus spoke about and his return was imminent, and therefore we should live accordingly. We hear it in 1 Corinthians, we hear it other places, not just in terms of how we use our wealth and possessions, but how we live. Paul says,
Yeah.
hey, if you're not married, don't get married. If you're married, stay married. If you're, kind of stay, just do what you're doing, because, this is all going to change very quickly. But then as we get into the 2nd century and 3rd century, all of a sudden the church had to figure out how to be self-sustaining and do ministry, and while also being authentic to the teaching of Jesus. And I think we've been wrestling with that ever since, right?
Right.
It's not an either or, it's a both and. There is a radical call to discipleship and to live differently and to use wealth and possessions differently than the world. At the same time, the church has had to figure out how to live for the last 2,000 years and continue to do ministry, and we've obviously not gotten that right sometimes, right? Because the church has certainly fallen into the trap of accumulating, wealth and been just as guilty of materialism in some ways as the world. But if we read the New Testament and don't feel that tension, then we're probably not reading it right. We should feel that tension of not either or, but both and, the radical call to discipleship and the practical need to live out ministry and, the life of the church in the world. And that's hard.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on, because verse 7 through 12, we're going to hear a slightly different voice of James here. Go ahead, Kathy.
Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, or you will be condemned.
Great. So in the span of about 10 verses, he goes from, you have condemned and murdered the righteous one, right, to how the Lord is compassionate and merciful, right? So we've got a very wide spectrum here in terms of how James is responding. But again, I think if we think of this more as a sermon or wisdom literature or teaching, it makes sense, right? He's issuing this stark judgment and then sort of turning to the community and saying, my brothers and sisters, my beloved, here's how you should be acting in the midst of this. So it very much, I think, makes sense. I just wanted to, you don't have to go here with me, but Matthew 5, which comes from the Sermon on the Mount. We've been cross-referencing a lot of James with the Sermon on the Mount. And I think here is one of the clearest references. In James 5:34, Jesus says, do not swear by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool. Let your word be yes, yes, and your no, no. Everything else comes from the evil one. And in James 5:12, do not swear either by heaven or earth or by any other oath. Let your yes be yes and your no, no. Or you may not fall under so that you may not fall under condemnation. I mean, here we have almost verbatim a quote from the Sermon on the Mount, right? So clearly James either had this teaching before the Gospel of Matthew was written, if it's an earlier composition, or this comes after Matthew, and James is reflecting on that teaching. But either way, we have this very intimate relationship between the book of James and the teaching of Jesus, in particular, the Sermon on the Mount. The other thing we have in these verses is a clear kind of hearkening back to the way in which the letter opened. Count it all joy when you face trials and tribulations, because that will create perseverance and endurance, and that brings about maturity and completion. So the call to patience, the call to endurance, blessed are those who show endurance. Again, an allusion to Matthew 5, blessed are those who endure and persevere, part of the Beatitudes. And then finally, again, language of eschatology. The Lord is coming soon. The judge stands at the door, right? All of these images that something very soon is about to change in terms of the spiritual condition of this community. Other thoughts on this section of chapter 5? The call to perseverance, the call to be patient in suffering.
How amazing it is that he's, as you say, claiming eminence to Jesus' second coming, and here we are 2,000 years later, persevering, because hey, as far as we know, he hasn't showed up yet.
But it's interesting. I mean, maybe maybe this is why Jesus hasn't come back yet, because we're still dealing with all the same things that James was warning about. It's such a relevant letter in so many ways, even in terms of its eschatology, right?
We still can't learn.
Yeah. I would also note, I think it was Father Derek in week 1 that brought up how so often James uses these mini parables. And here we have another kind of mini parable. The farmer waits for the precious crop of the earth, being patient until it receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. In this particular region in Palestine and Syria, they kind of had 2 rainy seasons. They still do. And you kind of planted in between and waited for that second rainy season. And if it didn't come, you very well might lose your crops, right? So that second rain, the latter rain, is what preceded the harvest. And so, but you had to be patient. You had to wait, expecting that latter rain to come. And sometimes it didn't come, and that was a crisis moment. But James uses that agricultural image of waiting for that second rainy season to come. And it's also, we live in the in-between times. And so it's another image of, we live between the first coming and the second coming, in the same way they're living between the first rainy season and the second rainy season. So it's a wonderful image that he plays with, again, kind of as a mini parable to help us understand what this waiting looks like.
I don't know why I was, but I was taken by the one phrase with, beloved, do not grumble against one another. And I thought, I don't know what the root of that word grumble is in Hebrew or Greek or whatever, but I think it's a great word. And I think it describes how we can interact with them. Not nicely, but how we can interact with others. And so being warned not to grumble, I thought was a good idea.
Yeah, I'm going to go to, can you all see that?
Yes. Mm-hmm. I can.
Just see it more.
Just the blue Bible,
Do you see that?
just the top.
You
Says-
can't
says
see it as I
blue-
scroll or anything?
No, the only thing is that it's stationary right now. If you're scrolling, it's not being displayed.
It's not moving at all?
Yeah, that move.
I just see a bar.
Yep, and it's,
There's a
Yeah,
bar.
it's just a white bar.
the bar says blueletterbible.org.
Okay, but you can't see anything else on
No.
there?
No,
Uh-uh.
no.
No,
I'm gonna try one more time just to see if this works. Can you see that at all?
There we go. Yep.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So since we've got a little bit of extra time today, I'll just, I've mentioned this in the past. This is a great study tool. You go up to the key verse, you can just put in James 5, and every verse from James 5 comes up. And then if you find the verse that it's the King James Version, you can change that. But grudge not against one another,
Yeah.
James 5:9, and then it opens up and you can find each word and it gives you the Greek. Now you don't have to be a Greek scholar, but these numbers are the Strong's numbers that correspond to Strong's concordance. It's an exhaustive concordance of every Greek word in the New Testament, and it's assigned a number. And if you click on that number, it gives you the transliteration, pronunciation, the root, the part of speech. It also tells you how frequently that word occurs in the New Testament. It occurs once in Mark, once in Roman, twice in 2 Corinthians. And you can scroll down and, it means it's been translated as groan, sigh, grudge.
Mhm.
The message in the message, it says complaint.
Complain.
Mhm.
And so you can look and see where it's been used. Romans 8, we ourselves groan inwardly. So it looks like it has a pretty wide semantic range. I don't think it's the word that corresponds to the word murmur in the Old Testament when the people of God murmured. I don't think this is that word, although it does have that as a possible translation to sigh or to murmur. Stenazo.
Right.
Anyway, so that's just a tool you can use if you're interested. And like you saw me scroll down, it gives you all the occurrences, so you can see how it was used in Mark, Romans, Hebrews, and James.
That's neat.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a fun tool. blueletterbible.com.
No, I love words. That's neat.
Yeah. And again, if you don't have to
.org.
necessarily know what you're looking at for the Greek word, but you can figure out what it means and so forth. Yeah. Okay, so now let's move into 13 through the end of the chapter. Can someone read that for us? Kathy, go ahead.
Is any one of you in trouble? He should pray. Is anyone happy? Let him sing songs of praise. Is any one of you sick? He should call the elders of the church to pray over him and anoint him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise him up. If he has sinned, he will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again, he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. My brothers, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring him back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of his way will save him from death and cover over a multitude of sins.
Thank you. So isn't it interesting that this book, which has been full of pretty hard words and harsh words and direct words, ends on a very pastoral note, and it ends with a focus on community, right? Pray for one another. confess your sins to one another. And if someone wanders and strays, help bring them back, because in doing though, you're saving their life by bringing them back, right? So the importance of living this out in the context of community. And in liturgical and sacramental churches, this passage is drawn upon as scriptural evidence for the call to anoint the sick and to practice confession. And so those are two of our sacramental rites in the Episcopal Church. So we have the sacrament of Holy Unction, where we, go and visit the sick and bring oil and anoint them directly out of James 5. And we have the reconciliation of a penitent, the sacrament of confession. That wasn't me. So right out of this short part of chapter 5, we have two of our sacramental rites referenced for the church. But so James isn't all, he's not going to beat you for the whole letter, right? He's got a pastoral side here. But other thoughts on how the letter ends? Yeah, Paul.
I find it interesting that the translation uses the word cover, and the way it's used here, cover, is also in 1 Peter, where he says, love will cover a multitude of sins or transgressions. I forget how the exact wording, but this and Peter 1 are almost the exact same ending.
Interesting. Yeah. And that's an interesting point, because there are some scholars who see a relationship between James and 1 Peter. So that's great. Yeah. Other thoughts on how it ends here? Do you like the ending?
I like it because it's a positive ending.
Yeah.
The first part is very strong, tore into the rich people, but now bring you back to today's world, and your actions can save you.
Yeah.
You can save someone else.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just our actions.
That's right.
It's also the role of the community. And I just love the way it ends, and I really read that as mutual, right? That sometimes we are the ones who do that for another, can help bring them back, can help be a pastoral support to them. And sometimes we are the recipients of that, right? Sometimes we need people in our lives who are the gatherers who bring us back when we have wandered, right? So I think it's a beautiful picture of community here at the end. Pray, and even the rhetorical device of these questions. Are you suffering? You should pray. Are you cheerful? Sing songs of praise. Are you sick? Have your community pray for you. Right? It evokes this sense of community and mutuality that I don't think you really get from the other parts of the letter. Right? So if you've only read chapters 1 through 2 or 1 through 3, and you don't get to the end, you miss this final call to live this out in the context of community. And I think it kind of makes sense of the whole rest of the letter, that we don't do this on our own, that we do this with our brothers and sisters in Christ. And that makes me feel better.
I liked, Doug, I really liked your idea that maybe this could be looked at other than as a letter, as maybe taking high points from sermons or teachings and trying to pull them all together into one. Because you're right, the context doesn't flow very well as a letter like Paul's do. But if you look at it maybe as either James or one of his followers pulling together high points from sermons and putting them down, maybe it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, James was not an apostle. This was they say his brother, but he was, and you said the bishop of Jerusalem, but not an apostle, correct?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we don't know much about James. If indeed this is the brother of Jesus, he doesn't really show up on the scene until till the book of Acts, and he's already in a leadership role. We do have James mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 when Paul talks about the resurrection. And Paul says that Jesus appeared first to Cephas and then the 12 and then to James, the brother of Jesus. And, and so he lists those who were witnesses to the resurrection. So the best that we can sort of piece this together, and maybe this is my own view, the Gospels tell us that Jesus' family thought he was crazy, right? And so why would we think James thought anything else, right? So because we don't hear James as a follower or an apostle early on, maybe it was that resurrection appearance that was his conversion moment. And then that's when he appears on the scene as an early leader in Jerusalem. And according to tradition was the first bishop, or, probably not, I mean, bishop means overseer. So the first one who was the overseer of the organization of the church in Jerusalem. Yeah.
And we do know that there is a James that is martyred on the steps of the temple in 77.
We do. Yeah.
Now, we don't know if it's this James, but the assumption is, since he's the leader of the Jerusalem church, and isn't he mentioned in the text where Paul brings money from his collections and he presents them to James and Peter?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, James.
Somewhere in Scriptures, and I forget where, but so we see reference to a James, who is in fact the bishop or leader of the Jerusalem church.
Right. Yeah, what I love about these Bible studies is, we're reading these as devotional books, where we are hopefully growing in our faith by reading these words. But we also have these moments where we are reading them as historical documents, right? And because we don't have a chronological history of the early church written by one person that kind of details the history of the development of the church, we have to piece it together from these fragments, from these letters and books and sermons and writings and gospels. They were all written at different times by different people, some of which we don't know exactly who wrote them or when. And so we get a reference to James and we got to kind of figure out, is that this James? Is it a different James? And then we get the complicating factors like the fact that James was a very common name, It's just like if someone were to write about a guy named John or Bob today with no other indication about who that was, we'd have a really hard time figuring out which John or Bob that was.
The Quest Study Bible at the beginning of each of the chapters says, why read the book, who wrote it, when. And it does say that this may have been the first New Testament book to be written somewhere between 840 and 50 AD. But the thing of it, and this part that is interesting is, why was it written? It was to warn believers of some habits they'd fallen into that undermine the essence of what they believed. Things such as favoritism, slander, pride, and misuse of wealth, and a lack of patience. The letter takes a no-nonsense approach to hypocrisy. James describes the evil of our tongue out of control, playing favorites for the wrist, or boasting about plans for tomorrow. Don't look for pious platitudes here, but expect a string of hard-hitting, specific, practical instructions to help you live an authentic Christian life.
Mm-hmm.
That's
yeah,
pretty good synopsis.
It is a pretty good synopsis, and it's really hard to tell if this is an early book or a late book. It very much could be that.
Well, it's somebody's guess. They don't know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we look for clues. One clue that it could be later is these apparent quotes from the Sermon on the Mount. So maybe if it's after Matthew was written, then it's much later. But we also know that a lot of this teaching material of Jesus predates the Gospels, right? It was around before the Gospel writers picked it up and included it in their Gospels. And we know that because the Gospels all share a lot of this teaching, right? And they all didn't get it from each other. There were other sources that they were drawing upon that predate the Gospels. So maybe James was aware of that. And if he was in Jerusalem, he would have been aware of that, right? He would have been at the epicenter of that development of the early teachings of Jesus. The fact that he doesn't have to explain a lot the way Paul does. I mean, Paul has to do a lot of explaining of things, especially in Romans. And, James assumes that we know a lot about who Jesus was and the teaching of Jesus. So that might be evidence that it's earlier, right? If he's writing to a community that kind of is right there in Jerusalem and has intimate knowledge of these traditions around Jesus. And there are very good biblical scholars who argue both ways. So it's kind of fun to think about that.
Well, our present belief is that there is the Q document, which if you read Matthew and you read Mark, there are clear indications that they're quoting out of a document that we don't have. Or
That's right.
We haven't seen, I should say. But, when you read their material, most scholars say there's documentation that they used, and they used it in common, and they used it like everybody knew what it was.
Right. Yeah, I think most biblical scholars must be Episcopalians, because if there's an obvious word for something, they don't use it. They use, some other word. Like we don't call it a lobby, we call it a narthex. We don't. So a Paul reference Q, just to unmask the mystery behind that. A lot of New Testament scholarship in the 20th century was written in German, German New Testament scholars, and the German word for source is Kella. Is that how you pronounce it?
I think so.
Quelle. And so to abbreviate that, they just called it Q. So it's not the character from Star Trek, if you're a Trekkie. It's a source, and it's probably not one book. I don't think we're ever going to dig up Q, the source, but there clearly is evidence that there was a collection of sayings and stories about Jesus that early Christians were aware of. Probably began as oral tradition and then got written down. And then when the Gospels were written, they were drawing upon this kind of common source, which is one of the only ways to explain why Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular sometimes have the exact same language, the same words, and yet we know they were written at different times and in different places. So anyway, so that's a long-winded New Testament scholarship answer. So let's move on, because we've got about 10 or 15 minutes. I want to share my screen again and go back to my PowerPoint. So to wrap this whole series up, what have you learned from the book of James? How have you been challenged? How have you grown in your walk with Jesus? And what is God calling you to do next? You don't have to answer all four of these. This is just to kind of stimulate some reflection as we think about the last 5 weeks. What have you learned? How have you been challenged? How have you grown? And maybe there's something that, you might be thinking about doing next, to study or to put this into practice in your life. So let's take 10 minutes or so just to reflect together on what we're taking away from this study on James. Everybody looks down the minute you ask a question. So who wants to go first?
One
Pick a
of the
question.
pieces that I marked, which I don't, for some reason I have a hard time doing that, but I know it's okay to make notes in it, but is in chapter 3, the end of it, and real wisdom, God wisdom begin with a holy life and is characterized by getting along with others. And I guess that's the challenge or a goal that I take from this, is to work harder at getting along with others, hopefully through good works. But maybe a little bit like, if for those of you who have never gone to Children's Chapel, which I hadn't until this morning with the school, it is so awesome. I mean, it is fabulous. But the day was on respect, and Doug should give the sermon he gave to the kids in church, because we'd all get it. I think, but it's, doing like the kids said, being nice to one another. And that is something that I take from this.
Good.
I go back to something Sue said right when we first started talking about in chapter 1 and 2, how direct and forceful James was in the rules that we had to follow and we were expected to live up to. And then towards the end of the book, to me, it kind of softens up in hoping for prayer and patience and not being critical of each other. So it's really a challenge. The word challenge keeps coming to me because he definitely expects us to have faith and then to use that faith to convert it into works that help the community. But then he softens up and says, I still want you to pray for those who are sick and pray for your own needs and have patience that God's going to come through. So it's really it hits you at first and then it softens up a little bit at the end. Challenge.
Good.
That's good. Yeah, that's a great insight. And then
I think it would, for me, it was, there was so much, and just as just said, there were so many things that we were told we had to do, and things that were very strict. But then with the softening at the end, I felt like I had come home, that this was okay. I can do this. I can go back and read all the rules that I have to follow, as long as I can read the ending also. I needed chapter 5, the end of chapter 5, not the beginning, but the end of chapter 5, to feel comfortable, because I wasn't comfortable with some of the strictness, and it seemed rather harsh.
Well, and I think one way to read that, especially kind of retrospectively after reading chapter 5, is to think about the directness and the rigidity of some of what he says, less about rules and more about transformation, right? That this, if we're really serious about our lives being transformed to such an extent that we are reflections of the very character of Jesus, this is what they should look like, and we should, be real about that, and be honest to say, hey, we can't bless God and curse others at the same time, right? It just, that shouldn't be what our lives look like, right? We can't say we've got faith and be pious and not care for the orphans and the widows and those who, so he's direct about it and he's harsh, but I think what I've gleaned is that this is less about rules to follow and more about being real about what our lives should look like and how our lives should be shaped, if we say we are followers of Jesus, you know. And it's very practical, right? I love the fact that, you know, it just gets down to how we talk and how we treat one another. And, you know, get out there and do something. Don't just talk about your faith. You know, it's very, very applicable in real life, even today. Yeah, Kathy, I stopped you there.
In that same sense that I had underlined in chapter 2, mercy triumphs over judgment, and the lesson in the NIV Bible says, because God will be merciful on the day of judgment if you show mercy in your life. And so, yeah, it's teaching not only the laws, but how to behave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It's a powerful book, and I think sometimes people shy away from it because of its harshness sometimes and its directness. But I think what I'm hearing from all of you is, now having read it in its entirety, you see the balance to some extent. You see the way in which the shape of the whole book is really calling us to this radically different way of living, in very practical ways.
The very beginning of the little thing in the Message Bible, it says James carried the nickname Old Camel Knees because of thick calluses built up on his knees from many years of determined prayer. The prayer is foundational to the wisdom. Prayer is always foundational to wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully, getting to the end of the book, you can see why he starts with joy.
Mhm.
You know?
Yes.
So it just kind of brings it full circle in terms of where he starts the letter. All right, well, it's 3:55. We can end a few minutes early. I've got a 4 o'clock Zoom meeting I'm going to be switching over to here in a minute. But let me just close with this. Today, two things. Today is the feast of William Tyndale, who was one of the reformers in the 16th century, Church of England, who was passionate about translating the Bible into English. And we are so used to walking into Barnes and Noble or hopping on Amazon and ordering our English Bibles that we forget that less than 500 years ago, it would have been illegal. And you would be potentially arrested for translating the Bible into English or possessing a Bible in English. But when William Tyndale fought the good fight in the midst of that, and was able to translate the entire New Testament, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Joshua, most of the Psalms, and he managed to do all that before he turned 42. And that was the age when he was executed. He was strangled and burned at the stake, simply because he was translating the Bible into English.
What nationality was he?
He was English. Yeah. And Henry VIII was part of the battle against him and his work, and part of the reason why he was executed in 1536. There's a quote that I'm going to paraphrase where William Tyndale approached one of his academic colleagues at Cambridge and said that his goal in life was to have the boy that pushed his plow know as much about God's word as he did, right? He wanted to get God's word into the hands of the common person. So I just, as we, kind of take it for granted that we study, multiple translations, lots of different options, websites where we can get, we owe that in large part to pioneers like William Tyndale, who died less than 500 years ago to fight for the ability for us to read the Bible in our own language. Final fact, most of his translation made it into the King James Version of the Bible. So phrases like, my brother's keeper and the Lord is my shepherd and we are the salt of the earth. Many of those phrases that we remember from the old King James are from William Tyndale's translation of the early 16th century. So anyway, that's
Very
a
cool.
little bit of trivia for today. Finally, next week, remember we switched to 2 o'clock for the Zoom, 2 o'clock for the Zoom. Father Derek has another class he's taking at 3, starting next Wednesday. So he will be sending out some information about the 6-week study on the book of Psalms that starts next week. So you can always come in person at 11. You can Zoom at 2, and then you can watch the recording posted on YouTube later on. So sound good?
Yep.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.